So environmental competency groups began as quite an experimental methodology when we began a project looking at the management of flood risk in some UK communities. And what we were interested in was that many of the so-called participatory methodologies, which is the larger canvas of methods into which competency groups very broadly fits, most of those participatory methodologies put the onus on creating fora in which groups of people, variously selected, can talk and discuss an issue that they share in common, but perhaps from very different perspectives. And the product of those groups tends also to be discursive. That is to say, it's about identifying some of the differences in the perspectives that people articulate and putting together, out of those different perspectives, some kind of an account or categorization of different ways of viewing the issue at hand. But in the world of environmental hazards and risks, in the first instance flooding for us, what is very apparent is that actually there are a whole series of analytical practices buried in the science that informs the way that flood risk is managed, that people who live with flood risk are only partly aware of, but to which they could make a major contribution in terms of their own local knowledge. So the emphasis of competency groups is very much more on how do the claims we make about the nature of flood risk, for example, the likelihood of a flood occurring in a particular place, at what frequency, on what scale, or with what intensity. Those kinds of predictions, which are the product of models of flood risk, can be usefully informed by local knowledge of that particular area. So environmental competency groups was a way to try to bring together the professional modelling practices of hydrological scientists, the people whose work normally informs the way in which agencies like the Environment Agency invest flood risk management monies, and the communities who live with those flood risks, but whose knowledge of the way that water moves through a landscape in their local area is rarely addressed or considered of significance in the way that professional modellers model. And it's to bring those two communities together with an emphasis on what's actually involved in trying to anticipate flood risk. What are the actual processes, the mechanics, if you like, of thinking about the physical relationships that are involved in trying to predict that process, the kinds of data that you need, not just remotely sensed data, but the kinds of data that arise from local knowledge. And similarly, how do you automate the processing of that data and the physical relationships that they pertain to get better, more bespoke models of flood risk that can inform better, more bespoke solutions, or at least ameliorative measures in particular places.